Hello everyone and welcome back to the third episode of our series on painting A Song of Ice and Fire miniatures. Today we've got a pretty long one for you because we'll be doing the first blocking in of primary colors on all of our miniatures, followed by a bit of a bonus on how I clean my brushes and my palette. We'll be starting with blue on Brienne of Tarth, red on the barding of the Blackfish's horse, green on Ms. Mormont's tabard, and yellow on the hood and other cloth parts of Gregor Clegane. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but I believe I said he was a Lannister guardsman in the first episode. That was incorrect. While perusing the art book, I found that it was in fact Gregor Clegane, and that he wears the yellow of House Clegane rather than the red of House Lannister. That would identify him more with the faction in game. I considered putting some red on just to tie him in more with the other characters of the Lannister faction, but then decided against it. I didn't want to ruin the color palette that he was developing too much, which is going to be a very subdued one of browns and metals, making him look like an imposing, dirty, simple figure, just like he is imposing, dirty, and simple inside. You might now be wondering why I'm starting with, of all things, the bright primary colors on their heraldry and such. By doing so, I back myself up slightly against mistakes. All of these colors are fairly light and therefore will be fairly easily covered up by any darker colors I apply later. Since a lot of these figures are going to be darker colors, such as browns and blacks, I'm going to be basically hedging my bets here by painting these areas in, and if I wash over the lines, not worrying about it too much. I'll get to it later, and I'll block it out. In particular, any areas that I've identified as being metallic are going to be very easy to correct, because instead of using a metallic color directly onto our primed surface, I'll be starting with a mixture of black ink and silver acrylic paint. I'll get back to why that is in a moment, but first, a quick lesson on charging brushes for ink washing. So what I'm doing right now is I'm putting a very, very little bit of brown into the yellow to get that dirty look I want for Gregor Clegane's cloth parts. When I've finished blending it together, what I'll do, as you see, is roll my brush inside the ink, therefore sort of reforming the bullet point and keeping the point on it. I'm not sure how obvious it is, I hope you can see that. I'm just giving it a twist of the wrist. Then I'm drawing the point across a clear part of the palette to show that I'm drawing neat lines and also to draw off some of the big bulb of paint from the tip of the brush. I'm going to try to focus my camera here so that you can see how the brush has remained pointed, but also has kept that little globe of paint right on the end where I'm pointing. That globe of paint is going to make your application quite uneven if you don't draw it off onto the palette before you go to the miniature itself. A little bit more fiddling with my camera later and we'll be almost ready to start actually applying it. By twisting my brush on the palette, I've kept a point that allows me to be reasonably precise when applying any paint or wash to the miniature, despite the low viscosity of these washes in particular. We want to keep that low viscosity because, as you'll be starting to see soon enough, it'll be pooling in the crevasses for us and giving us a bit of a more textured look than just a straight acrylic paint would. Going back to the palette to make sure to twist my brush once again and get an even coating of ink throughout the entire brush. As I carry on with the painting in the background, let's go back to my point about the metals. I'll be blocking in the metallic surfaces with a mixture of black India ink and silver acrylic paint, thereby giving me a glossy but dark surface that should survive through the varnishing. After varnishing, we'll be dry brushing on silver acrylic paint to give it the sheen of metal. Why are we doing it after varnishing, you might ask, when varnishing is supposed to be the thing that holds all of our paint on the miniature? You are correct about that. However, we'll be using a matte varnish in this case, specifically to remove the gloss from all of our inked parts. Quick aside again, I'm about to get some paint on the hand of Gregor Clegane, which is supposed to be a metal part. Here, I'm just going to wipe off the excess with my thumb and carry on. Mistakes are easily corrected, particularly on areas we're later going to be painting darker. As I was saying, the matte varnish will be used to remove the gloss from all of our ink areas. What it would also do in the process is remove the gloss from our metals, thereby leaving not a silver surface, but a flat gray surface. This, of course, wouldn't look very metallic, and would either need a lot more work to turn it into what painters call a non-metal metal, a technique that looks incredible when done by a skilled artist, but I won't be touching here because I am not that skilled of an artist. Or it would take another layer of a metallic paint, which in this case would start washing out all of those shadowed areas anyway. By waiting until after we applied our matte varnish to dry brush on silver to those dark areas, we'll maintain some semblance of shadow and also give highlight to all of the edges in only a single stroke. This saves us a little bit of time and effort, and also gets a fairly nice result in my opinion. So now that I have that slightly rambly explanation of our process out of the way, I'm going to leave you with the footage of blocking in all of the primary colored areas. As with the previous video, I'll be interjecting occasionally to provide my thoughts on sections that I think deserve them, and if you want an index of these, I'll put it in the description down below so that you can skip to areas that I have comments on. In the meantime, enjoy the footage, take a look at how I do things, and enjoy the free music from YouTube's audio library. Hey there, me again already. Just wanted to do a little zoom in quickly on Gregor Clegane's hood. We're already starting to see the effect of those pale areas, the raised areas that we dry brushed in white, popping through the ink wash while the ink wash settles into the crevasses themselves, giving us the appearance of folded cloth, without having to go back and do multiple layers of highlighting onto those areas afterwards. Obviously we'll be finessing this as we go along, but it's a pretty cheap and easy trick to give you some texture on your miniature. The one thing you'll want to watch out for is to make sure that the pools aren't too deep and washing out the color or looking a little unnatural. Make sure it's all well blended and wick away some of the paint with a slightly wet brush if necessary. As well, be sure to rinse off your brush thoroughly between miniatures, as I'm about to do as I start on Ms. Mormont. These occasions where I step away from my desk will be the only time I'm cutting or stopping the footage during all of this process to fulfill that promise I had to those who'd asked me to make these videos of keeping the video fully unedited, showing every brush stroke for reference. Here again on the Tabard, we're seeing a very good example of all of the highlighting and washing coming into effect. It's sinking into the cracks and pulling out those details for us. Again, make sure it doesn't get too deep, but if you do want to push around the ink so that it settles more into areas you know should be shaded, for example underneath her cross belt, then of course, go ahead. We'll be going over all these colors again later to shade them in, and in those areas we're going to be focusing on stuff like the underside of that cross belt just to get it a little more definition. Alright, and here once again I've gotten some ink into a location I didn't want it to be. In this case, my finger won't fit to just wipe away the excess, so I'll take a clean brush and just draw it away. Unfortunately, by the time I get to it, it has already dried up slightly, so the clean brush on its own is not quite enough. As such, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my airbrush flow improver, which I use as a thinner, and I'll be putting a little bit of it on my palette. You could do much the same thing with water, though it may be a little runnier and not quite as effective in drawing away stuff that's gone further in the drying process. But in this case, I'll just be dipping my clean brush into the airbrush flow improver, then using it to wick away as much of that blue as I can, just to make the application of the brown a little easier. I'm putting a little more care into this than I did Gregor Clegane's glove as well, because as I've mentioned, the glove is a metallic area, and the metallic areas are going to be exceptionally forgiving for spillover. The scabbard, however, I intend to wash in brown, so stains on that area may still be visible through the slightly lighter color. Keeping your plan for the miniature in mind as you go forward can help smooth the process and save you steps, or at least help you be aware of what's going to be going where later. I'm not the best at this kind of plan, personally, but I know that it can be helpful. I'll also take this opportunity to point out that her skirts here are looking quite cloudy as we put on the first layer of blue, and they probably will until everything settles through and dries, and they may maintain a little bit of cloudiness. At this stage, that's normal for the inks. We'll be going over it later with a little bit of thinner mixed in with a deeper blue in order to deepen these colors and get the shadows to really pop. In addition, the thinner mixed in with the inks when we do that next layer will help everything blend together and should take away some of the cloudiness. Any texture remaining after that is a feature, not a bug. Call it detail and carry on. Don't worry about this kind of thing. I swear, once the matte varnish is on, it'll look great. Now it'll probably quickly become apparent that this particular red ink, for some reason, comes on very, very pink. I don't love it, but we work with what we've got, and it does work okay for giving the highlighted areas a sort of red tint. Later on, when we go over all of the primary colored areas with a deeper color to deepen the shadows, we'll be adding a little bit of magenta to this. That'll give this a bit more of a pop and make it look more like the crimson red that we probably all envision for most of our red parts. Here again, we have a little bit of spillover, and this time I'm going to be fixing it in a different way again. Knowing that this area is going to be covered in black ink soon enough, as the horse is meant to be black, I'm just going to be wicking it away with the clean brush, and since this is still wet, it's going away quite well, and I just put the excess onto my thumb. For any of you who are worried about the health effects of India ink, my understanding is there are none, particularly by osmosis, so don't worry about it too much. I've considered wearing rubber gloves in the past while painting at the suggestion of my wife, but I don't enjoy the lack of dexterity and the fact that it doesn't quite correspond with where I feel like I'm touching, if that makes any sense. The gloves can form little folds, and these can touch areas of the miniature that you thought you were nowhere near. That being said, if you're worried about this kind of thing, I strongly recommend you wear the appropriate protective equipment. As with any hobby, there's nothing cool about endangering your life and limb for no particular reason. If you can keep yourself safe while doing something, do so. It's certainly not worth dying young over a couple of miniatures, no matter how good they are. As well, I may as well warn you now, in about 30 seconds my phone runs out of space for footage, so there'll be a bit of an awkward jump cut. I'm not sure what this flag was actually meant to represent, but I envisioned it as the flag of some Lannister troops that Blackfish is bravely charging into. As such, I'll be painting it red, and just leaving it crumbled below his horse's hooves. Alright, and that concludes the work for today, as it were. Now I just want to put in a few notes on how I clean up afterwards. I've already cleaned up my palette because I hadn't really thought of mentioning it until after I'd done so. But basically all I do is I add a few drops of the thinner if necessary, grab a dirty Kleenex, of which I normally have at least one, not with nose stuff on it, but with paint on it from having wiped off brushes, and just give it a scrub. For the brushes themselves, I wet them in the sink, rinse off all of the paint until the water is coming off clean, then take my big block of brush soap, which I believe I mentioned in episode 1 or 2, and just give them a scrub. While I'm scrubbing them, I try to make sure I don't muscle up the bristles too much, and then I use the crook of my hand, as you can see here, give them a twist as I pull it out, and it maintains a very nice point. I leave the soap on because that hardens up and keeps the bristles in good condition. That's according to the instructions on the side. I'm not really sure of the science behind it, but it does work. And then I just throw them back in my brush holder. My brush holder, of course, being one of those vertical pencil holder things from Dollarama. Pretty much anything can be done on the cheap if you try hard enough. That idea is courtesy of my wife, though I'm not going to claim credit. So as you can see, now I end up with a bunch of clean and pointy brushes, so they're ready for use again next time. Keeping that twist in mind as you work with your brushes at all times is going to be really useful for keeping them precise and getting brushes that you love. I know I was very frustrated with my brushes when they kept losing their point after the first few uses, back before I really knew how to take care of them properly. As I give this brush a second wash because it came away with a little bit of ink still on it, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Today we went over the process of blocking in primary colors on our miniatures, as well as some finer points about the cleaning up afterwards. I hope you all enjoyed it, and you'll tune in next time as we put in a few more colors on these miniatures. Until then, I hope you go play some games.